What is a butch? My name is Joey, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about what is a butch, because often I get that question and people don't even know. They get them labels mixed up, they get other things involved, but I am here to tell you. Specifically, I'm kind of talking about the actual issues that stem from TikTok. Back in the early days of TikTok, the word lesbian would get you shadow banned or get the video removed entirely, so people started to censor it by saying the dollar bean. That became such a joke that people started to do that, and then also make new labels to censor out the name lesbian. Now that's not the case anymore with TikTok and other apps. You don't need to censor lesbian or censor butch or anything like that because it will not be taken down anymore, but people are still doing it, and it's a part of like some kind of joke that has continued on and is making it worse. A big joke identity that is being made right now is WLW. That's what people say. They say, "Are you WLW?" Which stands for Women Loving Women, or WLW. But these labels are overshadowing intensive, deep, important labels like butch, femme, and gay. So right now we're going to dive into some history of butchism, definitions, as well as some famous butches and their accomplishments. If we were to Google right now what is butch, the Oxford definition would pop up. Oxford describes butch as having an appearance or other qualities of a type traditionally seen as masculine. So that encapsulates just any masculine woman it could be, but the actual lesbian definition of butch is a lesbian whose appearance and behavior are traditionally seen as masculine. And I think we all know what masculine is, but masculine can kind of describe things that are a bit manly, typically seen as male appearances. So that could be short hair, boy clothes, whatever that means, facial hair, body hair, bigger muscles, toned, just bigger in general maybe. Butch is a big label, and that can encapsulate a lot of identities into one being. And one of them can include trans lesbians, who are male to female. So we have the trans women that are lesbians, and we have trans masculine lesbians. Not to be confused with trans men. Trans men are a separate identity away from all these. But think about it, we just learned what masculine was, right? So think about in trans masculine terms, that is a person who is maybe female taking hormones. Doesn't have to be taking hormones, but they could identify as anything other than female, which is like me, for example. I don't identify as a female. I am a transmasculine butch. Butches can go on testosterone, they can get top surgery, they can use he, him pronouns and others, and also sometimes are referred to as boyfriend. Lesboys is also a title that people go by too that are under the transmasculine butch category. There are also non-binary butches who go by they, them, or other pronouns. Hormone replacement therapy isn't always about transitioning from one sex to the other. Often gay cis men will take estrogen. They will get surgeries to make them appear more feminine because it's not about transitioning from one sex to the other. It's about obtaining certain qualities that they can get from medically transitioning. It's not as uncommon as one would think. So categorically speaking, in lesbian, there are multiple identities. We're going to talk about just a few right now. So we just talked about butch. Butch is the big one we're talking about right now, which is presenting masculine. Usually butches don't wear makeup or present in a female presenting way, but not always. They do. In the lesbian category, there are also femmes, which are quite almost opposite from butches. Femmes present feminine. They wear makeup, they dress a bit more feminine. Sometimes they are typically seen as the norm. Sometimes they get away with disguising themselves as straight, more than butches would. And there's also a big one I want to talk about too. Stud. That is meant for only black butch lesbians. So for the lesbians, we had all those categories, but I will tell you too a little bit about the other side of our community, the gay community. Gay men also have different subcategories of their identities, one of which is bear. A bear can just mean a bigger, hairy man. Maybe heavier set, but usually very hairy. On the other side of bears, there are twinks. Twinks are usually hairless, they have a bit more boyish features, they're skinnier, and there are also otters, which are like twinks, but they're hairy. Another category, because you can go on and on about these categories, is jocks. So jocks are gay men who are kind of gym bros. They're usually not hairy, but they're gym obsessed. So we know now what butch is, but why don't we talk about like where it came from? The name butch originally just came from a shortened version of the word butcher. In 20th century, it was described as a person who is a tough kid. They even believe the name butch came from the famous outlaw Butch Cassidy. But as time goes on and language ever develops, it started to become more prevalent in the 1940s within the queer community of lesbians. They describe masculine lesbians as aggressive or even just macho women, until eventually those lesbians reclaimed that identity and took on the name butch. Within the 1950s, there started to become lesbian bars, and those bars became very, very targeted towards the cops and often was subjected to police raids. To enter those scenes, you had to identify as butch or femme, otherwise you would be turned away. Let's get into the history part of the lesbians. Historically, lesbians have been less noted in history than gay men. Often, queer women were seen as roommates or best friends and were put to the side and were not seen as lovers. I found a PDF from the One Archives Foundation that kind of lists the basic big components that come up into lesbian history, so I am going to dive into them. In 1700 BC, in Babylonian times, there was the first noted recorded lesbian in history, and it was called Salzacrum. I hope I'm saying that correct, which meant daughter men, or just essentially women who were able to marry other women. In 7th century BC, there became Sappho. Sappho was born on the island of Lesbos in Greece, which is where the term lesbian and sapphic derived from. Sapphic essentially means women loving other women, so that encapsulates every type of woman who likes other women, not necessarily just lesbian. Joshua J. Mark in the World History Encyclopedia goes into a little bit about Sappho. Sappho was highly honored on coins and in sanctuaries. She was a very respected poet. The more her works have been researched and read, they start to believe that Sappho might not have been lesbian herself. They started to think that maybe it was her persona in writing, but we still are not able to know. A quote from Mark says, "By the late 6th century BCE, the meaning of the term lesbians has changed from Lesbos to a woman who prefers her own sex." Then in 1649, we hear about the first cases of two women being subjected to lesbian behaviors. Sarah Norman and Mary Hammond were then prosecuted for having lesbian acts. They actually referred to it as lewd behavior. According to a Library of Congress blog by Jennifer Davis, they believed that Mary was actually 16 at the time and thus was not able to consent. But because of Mary's young age, she was let go and not prosecuted. She was just given a warning. Sarah, who they believed to be a bit older than Mary, because she had been married to a man for quite a few years before she met Mary, she was charged and she was subjected to court. She had to publicly confess to her crimes. Mary was old enough to be married, but she wasn't old enough to face the charges, so she was let go. Then in 1655, for the very first time in U.S. history, lesbianism was banned. It was included under anti-sodomy laws, and I'm going to read you this law because it's quite crazy. The New Haven Law listed 14 capital offenses in the following order: idolatry, which is the act of worshiping a person or thing as if were a deity or god other than God itself; witchcraft, blasphemy, willful, premeditated murder, murder in a state of sudden anger, murder with guile, bestiality in both men or women, men lying with men as with women, and under the same provision, acts of women against nature, and some kinds of adultery, man-stealing, which means kidnapping, false witness, perjury for the purpose of taking a man's life, invasion, insurrection, or public rebellion, known as treason, children over 16 smiting or cursing their parents, and this last one, rebellious sons over 16. So yeah, these were a little crazy. Then in 1883, lesbian was used for the first time in a medical journal in the US. And this was about a Joseph Lobdell. A distant cousin of Joseph Lobdell named Dr. Bambi Lobdell wrote a book actually about Joseph. And it's called A Strange Sort of Being, This Transgender Life of Lucy Ann / Joseph Israel Lobdell, 1829 to 1912. Dr. Bambi did identify the fact that she calls him a transgender man because the terms were not so much popularized at that time. I use the word transgender in its widest application to mean not cisgender and not gender conforming. Joseph Lobdell taught singing lessons, and this doctor then went to interview some descendants of some people who knew Joseph at this time. Apparently a lot of women danced with Joe when he was a singing teacher, Dr. Lobdell said, and this one woman said she remembered her grandmother saying, "I can't believe that's really a woman. He was the nicest boy I ever dated." Eventually, Joe went on to meet a woman named Mary Louise Perry. They were married by the Justice of the Peace. But then in 1878, Joseph was declared insane by his brother. Joseph was then taken away to Willard Insane Asylum in New York. And this is where a Dr. P.M. Wise published an article about Joseph. This was called A Case of Sexual Perversion. And for the first time, lesbian was used in a medical journal, and this is the quote from the journal. An incident occurred in 1876 to interrupt the quiet monotony of this lesbian love. Joe and her assumed wife made a visit to a neighboring village 10 miles distant, where he was arrested as vagrant and lodged in jail. Now this is a big debate because this is often lost in our history, for just queer history in general. We often get the terminology confused back then if these lesbians or trans men were actually lesbian or trans men, because they lacked that vocabulary that we are unable to look back on our logs accordingly to see whether or not they were one of those. So just like Dr. Bambi said, she uses the term transgender because that encompasses all gender nonconformity in that sense. We really don't know. I believe that Joseph probably did live a life as a trans man, but that is not up for us to debate. That is up to the deceased and our ancestors. To kind of finalize this video, I want to talk about some famous butches that are out in the world. First big one I want to talk about is Audre Lorde, who is a writer, poet, and womanist. Audre Lorde rejected terms like feminist. She was very critical of the feminist movement, as it often got rid of topics such as class, race, and sexuality. She preferred the term womanist. She was also the first Black woman to become the New York State Poet Laureate in 1991. A quote I want to read from her because I believe it is very, very important now. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. One of her most well-known books is called Sister Outsider. It is a collection of essays and speeches from other Black feminists at that time. The next important butch I want to talk about is Alison Bechdel. She's most well known for her cartoonism. Her biggest comic book series that she had going out for 25 years was called Dykes to Watch Out For. And if you didn't know, this is actually where the term Bechdel test stems from. If you don't know what the Bechdel test is, I will tell you. This is usually in terms of media, so like movies, TV shows, books, all those things. It's a simple test to fit the criteria of 1, has to have at least 2 women. 2, the 2 women have to talk to each other. And 3, they have to talk about something other than a man. One of Bechdel's comics actually became a musical. Fun Home won the 69th Tony Award for Best Musical. It was also nominated for 12 awards in 2015. And this takes me into my next butch I would like to talk about is Roberta Colindres. Roberta actually acted in Fun Home in this musical. That musical was about Allison's life, and it was a memoir in a comic series. And lastly, this brings us into the final butch of the hour, Leslie Feinberg. One of Leslie's most well-known books is Stone Butch Blues, which is a half autobiography and half fictional book about their time period. I found this quote from the Legacy Project Chicago, and it is a wonderful quote of Leslie's. Feinberg described herself as an anti-racist, white, working-class, secular Jewish, transgender, lesbian, female, revolutionary communist. Though she preferred to use the pronouns ze and her for herself, she added, "I care which pronoun is used, but people have been disrespectful to me when the right pronoun and respectful with the wrong one. It matters whether someone is using the pronoun as a bigot or if they're going to try to demonstrate respect." The biggest issue here at large is that censorship is starting to take over and replace identities, crucial identities that are in our history. We have become too comfortable with using the censored version of our words rather than actually using what we mean. Lesbian is not a dirty or sinful word, and we should be able to use it freely. Once we start to unlearn those thoughts that those words are dirty or bad, we should use something else to make it seem lighter and better, we will have a better time with self-acceptance. And it will also open up more willingness to understand other identities that we don't know or don't understand. Our culture cannot be lost. We have always been here, and we will always continue to be here. Thank you.